Lazaro, and I am the Assistant Administrator for the U.S. Small Business Administration's Office of Communications and Public Liaisons. And I'd like to welcome you to our third social media webinar with the W2O Group. As you may know, this webinar is part of a 5-topic social media series, and today, Aaron Stroud and Greg Matthews from the W2O Group will help you learn how to create content and engagement for Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Also with us today is a small business owner, Jim Storer. He will share with you some of his best practices. Now, in our first webinar, Aaron provided you with an introduction to social media. Today, we're going to take that one step further. You know, social media isn't just a marketing tool. It can be used as a critical component of your customer service model. It also allows you to engage with your customers online. And according to a report by Gartner, by 2014, organizations that refuse to communicate with customers by social media will face the same level of dissatisfaction as those who ignore responding to emails and phone calls. So this is certainly an important thing to be thinking about doing. Our team of experts are going to help you create content to fuel your channels, as well as provide you with best practices in building your following and engaging with and staying in touch with your customers. So enjoy this presentation, and with that, Aaron, please take it away.
Thank you, Fred, and great introduction, and it is sort of chuckle-worthy to think about the idea of ignoring your customers' phone calls or their emails, although there was a time where probably a lot of companies are not good at responding to email. As Fred mentioned, I am lucky to be joined by 2 experts, actually 2 folks that I've known for a long time and looked to for inspiration. So this is Aaron Stroud on the top left-hand corner. I'm a managing director at W2O Group. We're a consultancy that consists of a number of different agencies that helps clients build presences like we're going to be talking about today. You'll notice that I've listed the places where you can find that we blog. Greg and I both blog in the same place. I've listed our Twitter handles. Jim, actually, who I'll get to next, has a different blog, the Community Roundtable blog, a lot of good information there. And we are using the hashtag SBA Social today. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. This is essentially for anyone following along on the back channel on Twitter. So if you hear Jim or Greg sharing an idea that you really like, this is a good opportunity to put it up on Twitter and use that hashtag, and you can actually follow it along. Again, if you don't use Twitter or don't know what that means, then don't be alarmed. You'll get everything that you need here. So second up is Jim Storer. Jim Storer is a small business owner. He is also the principal at the Community Roundtable. And the Community Roundtable, if you think about it, is essentially a community for community managers. Now, a few years ago, community meant online community. Today, community is a bigger term, and it really sort of focuses on any place where there can be a community like Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. And Jim is an expert in sort of managing these communities, and he'll bring that insight to the table today. Greg is a colleague, but also heads a project within W2O Group called M Digital Life. Greg blogs, as I mentioned, on the WCG World blog, and his Twitter handle is @ChyMoose. So with that, I would like to get into a little bit of housekeeping. One of the questions that get asked the whole time is, are we recording this webinar? Yes, we are recording the webinar, and we will actually take most, if not all, of the slides and put those up on SlideShare, which gives folks listening in the ability to pay attention to the slides and be able to look at them without having to watch them in the video format that the recording comes in. The last couple times we were able to get this up within sort of 24 hours. I like to give ourselves a 48-hour window just in case, but we do try to get it up. If you registered for this webinar, you will get a link to the presentation, or if folks are just listening in, if you registered, you will still get a link to the presentation. During the presentation, you can feel free to ask questions via the questions module in the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen. You can ask those throughout. We will dedicate about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to address those. And I mentioned that if you want to follow along the back channel, we are using the SBA Social hashtag. That will also appear on the top right of a number of the slides. Last but not least, I would like to give a special thank you to Justin Levy of Citrix. Citrix was kind enough to provide the GoToWebinar platform that we're using today, and if you have any interest in finding out more, you can go to gotomeeting.com, but they were the ones that were able to donate this service so that we were able to do what we needed to do. So I'm going to give a couple of overview slides that talk a little bit about the social media space. Now, anyone that's sat through the first 2, you may recognize some of these slides because I did cover them. There's only about 4 or 5. And I just wanted to reground anyone that was thinking specifically about some of the channels, because these things do matter. So the big message here is it is easy to become distracted or lost in this speed of change. It's really hard to know, who am I supposed to be with? You know, am I supposed to be on Foursquare? Or, you know, how do I keep up with all this stuff? With some of the tactics and the strategies and the frameworks that we're arming you with, you can get to a place where you don't have to worry about all that. And specifically today, as we put in the title, we're talking about 3 very specific channels. You know, as we think about social media, it's a good idea to think about what it is and isn't. So while we are diving into 3 of these specific channels today, if you think about social media as a way to communicate versus having to worry about all these individual tools, you end up in a better place. So thinking about the telephone and, you know, the fact that you don't have to think about the technology to be able to pick it up and talk to someone at the other end. We are arming you today with the ability to sort of think through 3 of the more important social networks, and we are going to drill into those a little bit. Before I do that, just thinking high level, there is a tectonic shift that has occurred. So I grew up in digital over the last 20 years. Jim and Greg, I think, did as well. Certain things have happened in the landscape that have meaningful impacts for us, and it's one of the reasons why we appreciate everyone listening in today, is because of the fact that we will talk about some of those shifts and the best way to take advantage of them. So language, you know, some of you may just be here in the United States, some of you may be dialing in from other countries, but probably at least a good handful of you have customers in other countries. So understanding that you can reach 88% of the people online with using just 10 languages, and actually, if you want to shoot for about 50 or 60%, you can reach most of them at least in one of their 3 languages by using Mandarin, Chinese, or English, right? So it's good to be mindful of other languages. It's also good to know that, you know, you don't need to be a specialist in 50 different languages. We know that places like Facebook, Twitter, forums, and other social places are online, are where these conversations are happening. But there are different purposes for each of these channels, and we'll drill down into more of those. And then also, time of day. It used to be, for anyone that ever did traditional media and put out press releases, you always had to put them out on Monday if you wanted a big boom, Friday if you wanted to bury the news. And we're actually seeing that quite the converse is happening these days, where you're getting lower volume sometimes during the day and higher volume in the evenings because of the fact that that's when people have, you know, retired from work and they're home, or maybe they put the kids to bed. And so not thinking that if you don't put stuff out during the day, or if you want to try to experiment with night, that it's going to ding you, and actually in some cases it can be better. I'm not going to drill too much into this, but I think this is a critical slide, just understanding that we have about an 83% penetration of people who are online who are using social networks. And you'll notice, and again, we'll allow you to download the slides later if you'd like to, but this really sort of runs across the full age gamut, and even the 65 plus for those that tailor the mature audience. You'll notice that somewhere north of 32% of those folks are online participating in social networks. You know, if you look at the 50 to 64 sweet spot, that's about 50% of your customers. So as Fred teed up at the beginning, ignoring those customers like you might with email, you know, do that at your peril. This is another one where I won't go into all of these, but it does give you a sense of all of the different types of social networks that you can participate in. And again, we'll talk specifically about the microblogging and the social networks today. But if you think about, you know, these in context of all the places you can be, you know, as you get more savvy and you have opportunities to potentially build out other channels, thinking about podcasts or blogs or places like SlideShare, which we will put those slides up, discussion forums, et cetera, are critical. And actually, when you think about discussion forums, LinkedIn, which is one of the big 3 that we'll talk about today, actually qualifies as a discussion forum in some ways, because there are a lot of public and private groups that are happening now on LinkedIn. Just to tease a little bit, and then I'm going to hand off to my colleague Jim, so you don't hear my voice drone on the whole time. Facebook has 1 billion plus users worldwide. Actually, I think the latest number is about 1.2 billion. Over 60% of those folks log in daily. These are stats, by the way, that are taken right off of Facebook's website. The average user has 130 friends, so just think about the fact that every time you get one of your sort of people to engage with you, that's a share, a like, or a comment, they're sharing that with 130 of their friends, because anything that they're doing is going into a majority of their friends' news feeds. Average user spends 55 minutes a day on the site, so that's a lot of time. It's now across 70 languages, again, for those global folks, and over 80% of those users are outside the United States. So While we do have a lot of those folks here, 200 million, north of 200 million, there are a lot of them in other countries as well. And, other examples of social networks, Google+, we'll talk about LinkedIn and Path. So Twitter, over 200 million users worldwide. Twitter is a little cagier with their numbers because they're not a publicly held company. 20% of the U.S. adult internet users are on Twitter. So, pretty good portion of folks in the United States. It was the fastest growing social network in 2012. And then just to better understand, and a lot of you probably know this already, but a tweet's a 140-character message. It can include links to other websites and images, and it's really sort of become this de facto news feed. Anyone that watches ESPN or the news shows like CNN, et cetera, will notice that a lot of times Twitter is quoted as a source. Last but not least, LinkedIn, which is increasingly becoming a can't-miss social network, and certainly a good one for folks on this call to be paying attention to. 200 million users in 200 countries, 74 million users in the United States, and that's an ever-growing number. They have 2 new signups a second, which is, I think, fairly impressive. More than 2.7 million companies have profile pages. This is something that it's good food for thought to make sure your company has a page up on LinkedIn that you have thought through and actually know what's going on, and you've claimed it and you are the owner of it. And then last but not least, LinkedIn members are sharing insights and knowledge in more than 1.5 million LinkedIn groups. So this is that number that concept that I talked about discussion forums. So now for the good stuff. This is where we start to get into the tactics and the strategies. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to a really smart guy in the industry, Jim Storer, and Jim is going to talk about building community with Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So Jim, I will let you take it away.
Wow, Aaron, that was like the social media speed round. Thank you. Let's go to that next slide. Aaron did a great job introducing me. My name is Jim Storer, and I founded a company called the Community Roundtable, but we have a lot of free resources at communityroundtable.com, so you can check those out. So the first thing you need to think about is really thinking about this entire ecosystem. Aaron talked about a lot of different social networks that are out there, and this slide was built by a good friend and client, Bill Johnson at Autodesk, and I think it's instructive because it does have those 3 big social networks out there as outposts. I encourage you to think about those as part of a hub and spoke strategy. I really think you need to think about your organization's website and how that can be your hub, because technology is constantly changing, and you might see a couple of properties on this list that are no longer around. And that, I'm not saying Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter are going away anytime soon, but I do think that you need to think about those as part and parcel to an overall ecosystem strategy. So just something to think about as you're building out a strategy for social. So let's talk a little bit more about building a thriving community. And I've got 6 lessons that I want to talk a little bit about, and I'll give some examples with each one. So first of all, have a clear goal. A lot of companies hear about Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn. Someone at a cocktail party might say, you need to be on Twitter. And you may need to be, but you need to understand why. And it really makes a lot of sense to think about how you want to use these networks. Are you going to do it for customer support? Are you thinking about it for brand awareness? Are you trying to drive leads? And as a small business owner myself, when we first got started, we were trying to do all those things, and most small businesses are trying to do that. So you need to think about those specific goals, and I've got a case study later where I'll talk about some of the results we saw. Once you start to figure out why, that's going to inform who, because you're going to start to understand who it is you want to talk with and what they might be looking for. And once you start to understand who, that's going to inform what you want to do and when you need to do it. Aaron talked about the new prime time. Well, you might find that the folks that you want to interact with are late night folks on social networks, and so you just need to think about that as you're thinking about when you need to spend time, and you might need to do some time shifting. The next one that I want to talk about is having rules, and social networks are all very different, and sometimes they can feel like a bit of a free-for-all, but each network and its members behave differently and have very different expectations. I think it's important for you to think about how you're comfortable reacting to folks in social networks and how you want to interact with them. before you really determine, where you want to create those outposts. It's a good idea to set expectations with your corporate profile on each of these networks to make sure that folks that are going to be coming and looking for information from you on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter kind of understand. And a great example of that is Vistaprint, which is a client. They have outposts on all these different social networks, and their Facebook profile says, quote, "This is a U.S. page for fan and company interaction. This page is manned Monday through Friday from 9 to 5 Eastern Daylight Time. For customer support, please call," and they leave a phone number. They're really clearly setting expectations for when they're going to be there and when you can interact with them there, and they're giving you an alternative if you happen to go there outside of that. It's also important to let folks know what's allowed, what's not allowed. If it's a Facebook page, you can say, here are kind of the rules of engagement. Don't attack, don't shout down other people. There's really some best practices in creating rules for how you expect folks to behave, and that kind of gives you recourse if someone crosses over the line. So next, I want to go to keep a regular schedule. And a really smart person that I met a while back said something that I really thought about for a long time, and it's that consistency is more important than frequency. You don't need to tweet every 20 minutes, but you have to establish a cadence and stick with it. So figure out what you're comfortable with, what your audience is going to react best to, and then stick to it. You may need to share more on certain social networks in order to be seen, and Twitter comes to mind because there's such a, it's so rapid fire, as Aaron mentioned. You may need to schedule more tweets than you would if you're using LinkedIn as the social network of choice, where there's the pace may not be quite as fast. At the Community Roundtable, we're in the habit of saying good morning on Twitter, and we also say have a great night, and they kind of bookend our day. I think it's important to kind of have a schedule and set some of this up. Buffer is a good free app that you can use to help schedule what you want to share with your folks ahead of time. But beware of scheduling too far in advance, because a current event can happen, and something that you scheduled a couple days ago to go out around a certain time might actually seem crass. So just beware of that and monitor what you've got going out if there's some sort of current event that happens. Next, I want to talk about another important component of building solid relationships on social networks, and that's being multimodal. Get outside your comfort zone and create video, create audio, create images to support your goals. A lot of companies tend to focus on text, and when I talk with them about it, oftentimes it's just they're not comfortable either being on video or creating audio, or they just don't know how. But it's interesting to see how your customers will react to different types of content. So I encourage you to think about different formats, and they may react very differently to images than they would have if you just written something out. A great example of this is Whole Foods. They're always an early adopter in a lot of these social networks. They adopt tools, they try them out, and see how they're going to fit into their overall strategy. And soon after, they started using something called Pinterest, which is a image sharing tool and social network. They found it was the #1 referrer to their website, and so they started allocating more time to that social network. As you experiment, you're going to find similar sorts of trends with your customers, and I encourage you to get out there and try some of those new tools. Next, I want to talk about, we call them cheeseheads, and that's a term of endearment. We have folks that are really passionate about our brand, and we do everything we can to support them, to help them talk about us and understand what's going on with us. They may not be customers, and in our case, we've got a lot of cheeseheads who don't actually pay us a dime, but they love what we do, they share what we do, and they help other folks that may be paying customers find us. So take time to thank your cheeseheads, encourage them, and give them access to your team and your planning so that they can help kind of spread the word about who you are and what you do. They will support you in good times and in bad, and there are a lot of great examples out there of organizations who might slip up in social channels, and then they're supported by folks that they've helped support throughout their time on those networks. My last one is to talk about is don't ignore. And the title on this slide could also say don't delete. There are a lot of great examples of small businesses that have Facebook presences, and they might delete things that they don't like. I think that's a bad practice. Aaron talked about how you wouldn't ignore someone's email. A voicemail, you wouldn't ignore that. Don't ignore social networks either. It's really important that if someone asks you a question, if you've got a Facebook page, that you respond to them. Now, a best practice there isn't necessarily to give them the answer right away. The speed can be a little bit daunting, the speed of these social networks. It's okay for you to say, I don't have an answer to that, but let me get back to you, and give them a time frame. Setting expectations on when you'll have a chance to get back is really important, and then follow up on that. I think Scott Bonney at Ford does this really well. I don't think he's manning their Facebook page anymore, but in the early days, he would, if someone asked a question, that's exactly what he did. He wouldn't necessarily be able to get the answer right away. He had to kind of go through the Ford ecosystem to figure out who had the right answer. But he would often, within an hour say, I don't have that answer, but I want to get back to you. And he would let them know. The other thing to think about is it's not critical that you necessarily use social channels to respond every time or fully elaborate. I think Frank Eliason, who became kind of internet famous as the person behind Comcast Cares, would frequently use Twitter as a way to surface conversations, but then he would take them offline to resolve. And that was kind of his way of handling a lot of the very specific situations that happened with a customer. He didn't want to necessarily expose their account and that sort of information online, but he used it as a way to be reachable and then take that conversation offline. So sometimes, I like to say, sometimes a phone can be a community manager's or a social media professional's best friend. So just something to think about. So now I want to take a look at a case study, and this is the Community Roundtable, and we can go to the next slide here. So as a small business owner, my time is incredibly fragmented, and I'm sure a lot of the folks on this call can sympathize with that. We wear a lot of different hats. So you can see from this, I've got, 10 different things, 11 different things that I'm constantly thinking about and what I need to get done. So we used very early on, and we still do, we use Twitter. We can go to the next slide. We use Twitter to really achieve our objectives. And awareness is a major goal. I've talked about engagement, so understanding who our advocates are and having conversations with them and with potential prospects. Surfacing leads and creating demand generation, really important for a new company or a small company. And so what we did is we established a program that we wanted to figure out kind of these three levels of folks, who was lurking, who was engaged, and who was being proactive. And so we developed some ways to track that. We can go to the next slide. And so what we did is we created thought leadership. We've got something we call the community maturity model, and we threw that out into the wild and said, here's a way for you to look at how you're building a social business, how you're building a community, and evaluate yourself against, tried and true practices. We wrote a lot of blog posts. We created podcasts that were all free, and we just send them out there. We created proprietary research and said, posted it on SlideShare and said, it's free, have at it. And we found that by creating content like this, we were getting a lot back from folks, and we were developing leads. We were creating awareness in the industry. We also focused on value creation. So we didn't necessarily flood those channels with just our stuff. We became expert curators of community content. And so a lot of, if you look at the Community Roundtable's Twitter stream, if you look at our Facebook presence or LinkedIn presence, we are sharing other people's stuff, and that's a really important consideration. I think Greg's going to talk a little bit more about that later. So next slide, and this just gives you a quick graph. So these are the hockey stick there is retweets on Twitter, and so those are posts of ours that were retweeted, and this is over a short time frame. Website leads, you can see how those grew, and these are all just through the use of Twitter as a channel for us to share content marketing, if you will. You can see the website leads in blue. Sorry, it's a little bit small. And blog subscribers is the kind of greenish yellow line there. And they all were seeing positive results from our work in using Twitter to kind of content market our business. And next slide.
Actually, Jim, while you're doing that, I'm just poking around a little bit in the questions, and someone did ask, can you make the screen bigger? I have my screen as big as I can make it, but if you go up into the top left-hand corner, there is a way to toggle and actually change the screen size on your screen. So for any of the folks that feel like they're seeing a smaller version, you can go up and go into the 100% mode, and we'll make it bigger. And Jim just reminded me of that when he wanted to call out the fact that he apologized that his graph was smallish. Back to you, Jim.
Thanks, Aaron. And also these slides, I'm fine with making them available on SlideShare or wherever you need them. But yeah, just bring these all up, Aaron. Important things you can't predict. As you're putting yourself out there on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, you're going to be really surprised. Now, Linda on the top left, we'd never met her, and this was, her public result of her kind of exploring what we had to offer. And Jason joined us. We didn't know him until we met him through Twitter, and Sue became a member, and Paul has been kind of one of those cheeseheads that shares all our stuff and has been great to us over the years. So that's pretty much all I've got. I encourage you to explore, and some of these lessons hopefully are helpful in setting a solid foundation as you kind of go out there and try some of these new tools.
Thanks, Jim. And now we're going to talk a little bit about online activation. And by way of background, Greg is one of our senior folks at W2O Group and actually does a fair amount of training and does them with groups of 2 all the way up to 100. And so a lot of what he's bringing to you are sort of time-tested methodologies and tactics that not only does he employ as an individual practitioner, but also training that we end up giving to a lot of our clients, both large and small. So, Greg, with that, I'll let you take the wheel.
Excellent. Thanks, Aaron. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Terrific. So, first of all, I'm really glad to be here, and I'm excited to be able to share this model. It's something that I realized about a year ago, that these things that I had been practicing for the last 5 or 6 years might actually be useful for other people. And I wanted to just clarify, even though I am a social media practitioner today, and I actually learned a lot of this stuff while I was working for a big company. When I was working for that big company, I was trying to sell new products and brand new businesses, and it was just me, and this was not my day job. This was my moonlighting job. And so, like many of you, I had to figure out, how do I overcome some of the things that we often think about when we think about barriers to success in using social media. And some of them are, I don't have enough time. That can be a real time suck. I don't know really how to get started. I don't know what to say. I don't know if my audience is out there. And so what this model that you're looking at here is intended to convey is that we've created this in such a way that you should be able to execute against this model in about 15 to 20 minutes a day. So we wanted to take the time out of it. And the really interesting thing is that when people think about social media, they tend to think about that lower right-hand square, that create square. But actually, there is a ton of stuff that you can do before you say a word on any social media channel or make a single post that is going to help you connect better with your audience, to understand their needs better, to understand the language that they're using, and frankly, to make sure that you have something to say that is going to be valued. And so what I'd like to do is actually start in the upper left-hand corner, the read section. If you could flip to the next slide, Aaron. So the idea here is that if you can get to a place where you can spend just a few minutes a day and make sure that you're catching up on all the news that's relevant for you and your customers, and just as importantly, none of the news that isn't, that's going to help you to be in a very good place to understand not only what is going on that's relevant and timely, but it's going to give you fodder for being able to share that information with your customers and with your followers in such a way that it adds value for what they're doing. So what you see in the screenshot at the bottom there is a tool that, if you have an iPad, you may have seen this. It's called Flipboard, and Flipboard is it's what's called a reader tool. And it's used to be able to bring very specific pieces and types of content directly to you and allow you to create essentially your own personalized magazine. And if you could hit the next slide, Aaron, there's another tool that I use personally a great deal and have counseled many of the dozens of people that I've taken through this model to use. That's called Feedly. That's one that you can look up later as well. But again, this is one that you can bring specific outlets and specific pieces of content to you. So if you imagine, if you're a local business, one of the things that you're going to want to pay attention to are what are the local events happening in my town. So you're going to want to perhaps pull in some feeds from the local newspaper or the local radio station, maybe the local chamber of commerce. Or if your business is a small business but has a national, maybe a B2B audience, some of the things that you'll want to pull in are maybe information from trade associations or information about the the specific type of business that you're in. You can bring all that into one spot. If you can flip to the next slide. Most of us are familiar with the concept of collecting a feed from an outlet. So if I want the New York Times Business, or for me, if I want the Austin American-Statesman, I know that it's not so hard to collect that feed and bring it into a reader. But what a lot of people don't know is that Google News can actually be a huge friend to you here as you're building out your reading list. What you'll see here is you see an example of a search that I did in Google News for Austin Chamber of Commerce. And you can see that I've clicked the news button underneath, so I'm not looking at everything from the web about the Austin Chamber of Commerce. I'm just looking at where the Austin Chamber of Commerce comes up in the news. And if you flip to the next screen, what you'll see is that any of the search results that come up in that Google News search, I can, by clicking that little RSS button at the bottom of every Google News search page, I can bring that into my reader in such a way that whenever the Austin Chamber of Commerce is mentioned in a news story, I get that news in real time in my reader. And so imagine being able to do that if you, if you are an architect, being able to get news about new materials or new appliances or fixtures being brought directly to you. You can do that through a Google News search, and it's a way to make that reading experience really robust. And one of the things that I should mention is that when you use tools as your readers like Feedly and Flipboard, both of those tools actually allow you to share content. So if you see an article you like, you can share that through your Twitter account, your Facebook page, your Google Plus page, whatever it might be, directly from the article. So it's a real time saver to be able to use that reader and essentially use it to filter out all the content that you don't want and make sure that you're getting everything you do want in real time. You can move ahead there, Aaron.
Yeah, and Greg, just one quick comment to that, which I really love, and we've talked about this on, I think, both of our webinars that we had prior to this, and that's the idea of curation. And I think you touched on it on your model up in the top. That bottom right was the create. But this concept of reading and understanding what's good content that you can share, people that are good curators add a tremendous amount of value to the online space. So you could theoretically not ever create anything, but if you're, through your handle, are engaging people and curating good content using the tools that Greg just talked about, great, great, great way to add value to other people's lives. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
No, that's great. So as you look at the next phase, then as we move to the next box, which is the Connect box, this is one that often people don't spend enough time with, but it's incredibly important. Being able to connect with your customers on the channels that they like to use is really important. And, we've talked about the big three in this discussion, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and for most businesses, you're going to do pretty well if you can cover those three. But it may not be as easy as it sounds to actually find your customers on those channels. So one of the things I wanted to suggest is that as you find outlets who are using Twitter or Facebook that maybe speak to the same audience that you do. So again, maybe in our local business example, I might want to go to my Chamber of Commerce Facebook page or Twitter page and see who are they following and who's following them. Because the likelihood is that those people are going to be interested in me as well. You can also do that with your competitors, right? So if you have a competitive business, it's easy to look at who's following that competitive business and think, well, if they're interested in my competitor, there's no reason they couldn't be interested in me, and go ahead and make those connections. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention with Connect is that as you're going through your reading list, you'll hear me hinging back to this on just about every one of these steps. You're going to be able to, as you're reading, find authors and find subjects of articles that are going to be interesting for you to follow or connect to using your LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And so as a part of your reading, make it not just about the reading and not even just about the sharing, but also about connecting with those people that are mentioned in the article. And this is one of those things that as you do it little by little, this isn't going to get you 1 million Twitter followers overnight, but if you do this for a month, 2 months, 3 months, you're going to find yourself likely well into the hundreds and on a great trajectory, never spending more than 15 or 20 minutes a day. Can you flip to the next slide, Aaron? So this gets to the point that Aaron was making earlier about curation. And it's one of the real questions people have of, gee, what do I actually post? You've probably heard from other social media practitioners, it's not great just to talk about yourself all the time. You want to be able to add value to what others are doing. And so curation can be a great way to add value to your community and not just talk about yourself all the time. So as you're going through your reading list and finding stories, articles, events that are interesting, share those on your channels and always make sure that you are crediting and mentioning the authors of those channels. It's a fantastic way to build relationships. And I showed an example here of a local Austin business. I'm in Austin, Texas, if you hadn't figured that out. Called Twin Liquors. It's a store that I really like. And Twin Liquors has this amazing Twitter account that is totally plugged into the community. And what you'll see here is Twin Liquors has retweeted this content from Austin City Limits Live. Now, this is something that people in Austin really are passionate about. And so Twin Liquors is adding value to Austinites by sharing this content that they care about, right? They didn't say anything about themselves. All they're doing is resharing content from this local iconic entity. And it's a great way to add value to your audience, but also to forge relationships with other entities that you can do audience sharing with. So, you know, it wouldn't be out of the question to see ACL Live starting to tweet something from Twin Liquors, for example. And as you do that, you're going to get into these routines where it becomes easier then to share your own content, to tell your own story, because it's clear you're not out there just, you know, as a huckster. You're out there adding value to the community. And every once in a while, every, you know, 4 or 8 or 10 pieces of content can be something specifically about you. And if you flip to the next slide, Aaron, what you can see is an example of one way to do that. And again, I'm sort of sticking with my Austin theme here, but what you're seeing here is an Instagram picture from a local company called Torchy's Tacos. And if you've ever been to Austin, you'll know that this is it's one of these things that people will fly in and head immediately from the airport to Torchy's. But Torchy's has this Instagram page where they are sharing this. They're sharing photographs of things that their readers love, lots of pictures of food, but also lots of pictures of patrons and Austin stuff and Austin events. But you can see here they've shared this picture from one of their restaurants, and circled in the upper right-hand corner. They had 145 people that liked this picture because it resonated with them, and it was something that had to do with their brand and was important to their brand. So if you flip to the next slide, Aaron, and I know we're nearing the end of our time here, but I think our timing is perfect. There are a few things that I wanted to lay out here that you can do on a daily basis, sort of rotating through to improve your acumen in each of these areas. I'm not going to go through them in detail here, but I just want to give you kind of a snapshot. So as you're reading, you know, if you take, you know, make it your habit to add one new source to your reading list every day for 2 weeks, all of a sudden you're going to have a really nice reading list, for example. Or as you are scanning through your Twitter feed and looking at the people you follow who are, ideally are, you know, either your customers or other organizations who care about your customers, you're going to be able to learn who is who is open to engaging on Twitter. Who's going to respond to you when you tweet about them? Who gets responded to when they tweet? So it's a great way to be able to learn. And as you look at Connect, there are simple things you can do with your Twitter accounts. If you give Twitter access to your email address book, it will find all the people on Twitter who are in that email address book. And so hopefully, over time, you've collected some customers and other relevant parties into that address book. It's an easy way to start that Twitter account off right. And if you can flip to the next slide, Aaron, this is where we can kind of close. This last slide takes what you just saw and breaks it down into a tremendous amount of prescriptive detail, but they're tiny, tiny bite-sized chunks. I've mentioned things like importing your contacts into LinkedIn or Twitter, subscribing to a new Twitter list. If you are interested, this 21-day plan exists as a part of our model, and I'd be happy to share it with anybody. If you want to tweet me at @ChaiMoose, I will make sure that you get a PDF version of this. And essentially, it's going to give you 5 or 6 things to do each day in your 15 minutes that are going to help to build up that acumen in a very tactical, methodical, but real and authentic way. I think that does it.
Excellent. And I am just going through the questions, and some really good questions in there. So now we will take 15 minutes to answer some questions. And I think one of the, I have a comment, 2 comments first. So one of them was the Facebook statistics that I gave earlier were a little misleading in terms of time spent on. That's absolutely true. You can bend statistics any way you want them to, but I think what I was trying to get across is that a lot of people are spending a lot of time on Facebook, and so it is a place where there is a lot of traction happening. The question that I'm going to tee up for you, and a few other people asked about what that scheduling app was, Buffer. I just put it in the answers as well, but Buffer.com is the scheduling tool. I think one of the things that I want both of you to weigh in is, someone was asking, yeah, I get the fact that Facebook and Twitter are good for consumers, but what about business to business, and what if you're like a computer tech support? Jim, I'm actually going to gear this to you because you actually work in a place where your service is B2B versus B2C, so it could be completely analogous to that question. So talk a little bit about how you make sure you look at the quality versus quantity, and how you tap into places like Facebook and Twitter as a business selling services to other businesses.
Sure. Well, for us, it's maybe we're fortunate that we are a business that helps folks that are interested in social, and that may make us a little unique. But I do think that by kind of following the plan that Greg set out, very, like you said, prescriptively, I think it's a great way to go about it. Curating a lot of content. I mean, when people think, so we've been doing this for about 4 years, and we have become really considered the curators of all the good information for community managers. And that happened not because we were creating all that content. So I do think, Aaron, to kind of directly answer your question, focusing on creating content and sharing content that is really interesting to those folks is the way to do it. And again, using feeds like Greg pointed out to surface that content, following people, creating lists. I mean, one of the really great features on Twitter is to surface and create lists of people that are interested in certain areas. They might be geographically located. I've found people that I've been interested in interacting with by using the advanced search on Twitter, and I think like 1% of Twitter users actually use it. It's incredible how granular you can get in your searches, and you can find people. So you can search within X number of miles of you for tweets that contain this term. And if you're a business that focuses on B2B locally, you might find some folks that locally you want to network with, you want to connect with, because they could become a channel partner, they might become a customer. But the search capability within a lot of these networks is phenomenal to help a B2B business connect with the right people.
Great. And actually, Greg, I'm going to tee this next question up just so we can chew through these. Similar question, but it's what's the best starting point for a solo practitioner in a specific service-oriented business? This person, gives an example of medical massage therapy. So on LinkedIn, because we haven't talked as much about LinkedIn, but maybe you could give a couple of strategies or examples of how someone that is a solo practitioner could think about tapping into their right audience and connecting and sharing using your methodology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish that we had spent a little more time on LinkedIn, because it can be a terrific tool. And I'm going to go ahead and make the assumption that the solo practitioner probably has some element of local in his or her business, and the is one that they're trying to reach. But I guess what I would suggest is a great resource, not just for connecting to people you know, which is often how people think about it, but LinkedIn group can be a tremendous way to connect with others who have similar interests and passions. And so, Aaron, you mentioned that there are 1.5 million LinkedIn groups out there. The strong likelihood is that there are LinkedIn groups, multiple LinkedIn groups that have been created for other solo practitioners like yourself, or perhaps people who are into alternative medicine or holistic health. And by joining those groups and connecting with others, it's going to, number one, be a great way to access the content that they're sharing. But there's also a pretty decent likelihood that those folks are going to be, there will be some of those folks in your local area with whom you could connect. So I think LinkedIn could be a good place to get started with your sort of professional peers. As you're thinking about connecting with your public, your customers, I think the stronger likelihood is going to be that Twitter is going to be your best friend there. If you think about, who's following the Twitter account of the local spa, or the local wellness center, or the local chapter of Weight Watchers, these are things that all indicate people who are interested in their health. And the likelihood is, if people are interested in their health, they may very well be interested in the services that you provide. And so being able to follow folks who are likely to have those kind of shared interests is a great starting point.
Great. So a couple of housekeeping things. A number of people have asked, and I mentioned this up front, but I know some folks joined late. We will make available a recording of this webinar, so you'll get the voice and pictorials that ride alongside with it, as well as making the slides available. If you registered for this, you will get an email with those, and part of that will be the 21-day plan. And maybe we'll even put up a specific PDF of the 21-day plan, because there were a couple of folks that said they weren't on Twitter. One of the questions that actually maybe each of you can give me a quick answer to, but how can we small business owners turn these practices into sales? Now, I know the longer answer is it's sort of a slow roll, right? By building engagement, making those connections, you have people that start to refer to you. One of the sites we didn't talk about is SlideShare, although we did mention that we're going to put the slides up in SlideShare. But Jim, why don't you talk a little bit about how you, as someone that is a small business owner that does B2B, how do you turn your activities on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn into sales?
Sure. So I think I mentioned we create a lot of content. We share a lot of other people's content. And what we've done is we put presentations, we put research up on SlideShare, which Aaron mentioned, and it's a very active community for folks that are interested in looking at presentations, and if they're searchable, people can find them, and what they do is it's content marketing at its finest. Folks find it, they appreciate what they see, they can either fill out a lead form on SlideShare, or they can come back directly to us. And so we tend to see a lot of organic sales come to us, or leads come to us from these different networks. To go back and quickly just kind of piggyback on what Greg was saying earlier, I see I'm able to locate potential customers better in Twitter, and then I'm able to nurture them in other networks. So I kind of see, if you're thinking about a traditional funnel, I see the Twitter sphere as kind of my open palette to find folks, and then as I connect with them there and start to begin developing a relationship, they either join me on LinkedIn or join me on Facebook or SlideShare, and I can kind of move that relationship along. It is a little bit longer, but you will see, as you put yourself out there, you share content, you share ideas, that the folks that are interested in what you're talking about and what you're sharing will come back to you.
That's a good one. And Greg, actually, I'm going to tee up a separate one to you because I think Jim did a good job in answering, and this one is so in your wheelhouse that I couldn't not. So this comes from Joe Whiteside. It says, what form of social media has been most effective at reaching medical professionals, i.e. doctors, physical therapists, hospitals? Given the work that you're doing in Digital Life, the project, maybe you could take a minute to address that.
So, yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky question to answer because right now we're seeing a real boom in terms of medical professionals and, frankly, healthcare professionals in general taking to the social web, and so we're seeing a real proliferation of bloggers, of people who are using Twitter and Facebook, in many cases to build a personal brand. Definitely with LinkedIn, there are enormous groups of healthcare professionals and hospital people who play various roles at hospitals and other kind of provider organizations. So I think, again, LinkedIn is probably the place where you're going to find a bigger percentage of people. It's a place where folks tend to feel more comfortable. They feel a little less out there. It feels a little more professional, and so they're likely to be able to connect with a greater number of people in LinkedIn. What I would tell you, though, is that I think even though you'll find fewer of those people on Twitter, we're still tracking many thousands of physicians, not to mention other healthcare professionals on Twitter. And the audience tends to be a lot more active and a lot more passionate and a lot more open to engagement, because LinkedIn can be a fairly passive experience if you're not really making a point of using it, whereas Twitter tends to be a place that if you're there, you're really there. So, for example, for the doctors that we track, like 2/3 of them tweet more than once a day. That's a pretty big percentage, and it indicates a lot of activity. So, if I could only use one, it would be Twitter.
That's helpful. So I'm going to sort of take us in a little bit of a different direction, and this is a question that a few people asked. And Jim, I'm going to gear it to you because I think you'd be best served to do it. But it says, if you remove your personal page on Facebook, then leave only your business page, because you can have two different types for those that don't know. If you do have a business, you really should set it up as a business page if you're acting as a person. Personal is good. You can't actually remove your personal page and just leave a business page, because you need to have, unless you have someone else who's an administrator. But there is a way to toggle back and forth between the two. And I think in terms of when should you, because someone else asked, is it good practice to go in as a business and like or share, on other people's pages? How do you tackle that as someone who's both Jim's store and one of the representatives for the Community Roundtable on Facebook?
It's a great question. I tend to do more on the personal side. I've got we're a small business, but I've got someone who spends more time being the Community Roundtable on Facebook. So I guess I don't really know how to respond to that, other than I do a lot of my business connections using my personal account on Facebook. When we share on Facebook, a lot of the times when we're sharing like content and things like that, we'll do it through the Community Roundtable account. And then as interactions happen within our page, within our business page, a lot of those happen as the Community Roundtable. I'm not diving in there a lot as Jim Storer. Does that help?
Yeah, well, I think you gave an answer. And there's no right answer to that, but I think, a lot of businesses do find that, especially as a small business, people may know you. Whereas if you're working for a large company like, Exxon or Mobil or someone like that, that it may be more appropriate to do it. Or if you're a community manager of them, then you're doing it as an individual. But I think it's whatever feels right to you, and maybe thinking through the lens of, how do your customers know you best? Do they know you as Patty, or do they know you as, Business Pro or whatever it is? So I think that's a very helpful answer, Jim.
We try to let people know who's behind the logo. So whether it's Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, we want them to know that there's a person back there and who it is when we're responding. So even if we are using the logo to respond, we want them to know who it is.
That's good. So another person asked, for a small business type not using social media, and I know I have to walk a fine line here because this is an SBA webinar, but as a Dummies book author, there is a really good series of dummy books that help with social media. Now, here's where we get around we can't endorse anything that's, sort of a paid service. A lot of the dummies content actually is up online. I know they've taken my book that's on location-based marketing, and they've actually streamed out a number of the different chapters. And so you can actually go and find a lot of that online if you're looking for the free version of it. You can also find out if you do a little bit of hunting and pecking on Google or Bing, and search. There are some videos that Lee Lefevre does. Jim, do you remember the name of the types of the videos that are out? Oh, Common Craft. You go to Common Craft, COMMONCRAFT.com. Lee has created a lot of these stop animation videos that show you specifically, what the role is and how to use things like Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, et cetera. So those are good sources. We're just about at time, so I am going to wrap up here because I know folks always get a little nervous